Hey, Joel here, and in this video I will be showing you how I made this computer desk. Let's get right into it. The top of the desk will use a torsion box design, so I start off with two 8-foot sheets of plywood. The desk is only going to be 6 foot long, so first I cut the plywood sheets down to length, and then I cut them down to width, which is about 26 inches. Since the desk will be going in a corner, I went with a hexagonal shape. This means that I need to cut some angles off of each end. To do this, I first mark out the lines and then make some rough cuts with the circular saw. I then attach a straight edge to use as a guide, and I clean it all up using a router with the flush trim bit. Next, I cut the support pieces that will be sandwiched between the two sheets. These are made from some 3/4 inch pine boards that I reclaimed from an old garden shed. I rip them down into 1-inch strips on the table saw, and then cut them to final length on the miter saw. Then it's just a matter of gluing them into place and securing them with some brad nails. Lots and lots of brad nails. And of course, I felt the need to give it the mandatory stress test. Alright, and at this point I start to work on the legs. And actually, you know what? I'm just going to show you the highlights for this part because there are a few things that I want to address. First off, the process of making these legs was a learning experience. There was a lot of trial and error, and I got there in the end, but honestly I wasn't happy with the result. The legs were a little uneven and a little too narrow at the base, which caused the whole desk to rock a little bit. And secondly, I did eventually upgrade to a fancy motorized base so I could use the desk for sitting and standing. So basically I made the legs but didn't use them, so I didn't want to spend a ton of time in this video going over how I made them. If anyone does want to see the full build process for the legs, leave a comment and I'll consider doing a separate video in the future. Anyway, let's continue on with the top. The top is going to get a cherry veneer, but before I do that, I need to cut some holes that will be used for several grommets that I will install later in the video. On the underside of the desk, I was able to use a hole saw. However, on the top side, I needed to use a router with a custom template since the grommets needed a snug fit. Then after a quick sanding, I tape off the edges and give the underside a coat of white paint. Now I can start working the cherry. Since I am going with a herringbone pattern, there will be a lot of varying lengths that I need to figure out beforehand. So I need to do some math to determine how much material I will need. Once the boring stuff is done, I can mark out the lines on the boards and then make the cuts on the miter saw. Next, each piece is trimmed to width on the table saw. Then each piece is resawn, giving me book match pairs. And finally, each piece is run through the planer to give everything a consistent thickness. Instead of running each piece through the jointer, I opted to sand each piece by hand. The edges were already pretty straight, and I didn't want to risk having any tear out on the jointer. Once all the edges are ready to go, I can begin the glue up. When doing a herringbone pattern, it is critical to get the first two pieces exactly square. If they aren't square, each subsequent piece will be off, and the whole thing will look wonky and will likely have some significant gaps. So using a carpenter's square as a guide, I carefully place each piece. I clamp down one of those pieces to keep it from drifting, and once I'm happy with the placement, I spread out some glue, and then tack the board in place with some pin nails. I then repeat this process for each board, and I let the glue cure for a few days. Then using an all-purpose cutter, I trim off the excess cherry. And yes, I did need to use a little filler, but the gaps are actually pretty narrow, so it's not that noticeable. Next, I will be adding an inlay around the edge, but before I do that, I need to make sure the surface is flat. So that means sanding. Lots and lots of sanding. And once I have a flat surface, I can then use the router with a rabbet bit to cut a rabbet around the edge of the top. For the inlay material, I had some offcuts that I picked up at an auction. I am fairly certain this is cocobolo. I plane it down to the correct thickness, and then I ripped each piece to the correct width. For the miters, I used a backing board to help reduce tear out, and that seemed to work pretty well. Then for the glue up, I simply just taped each piece into place. Next, I will work on the edge pieces. And again, I am using cherry. I do some rough cuts on the miter saw. Then I run each piece through the planer to ensure even thickness. Next, I rip a clean edge on the table saw. Then I cut each piece to final width. And again, for the 45s, I am using the miter saw. At this point, I decided to round over the edges. I did this using the router table with a 1/2 inch roundover bit. Then for the glue up, I lined up the pieces by temporarily clamping them into place, then a liberal amount of glue and a few brad nails to secure it. After the glue cures, it's time for more filling and more sanding. We don't need to see this again, so I'll just skip ahead. Now you may have noticed these sharp little edges sticking out here. I carved these down by hand using a sharp chisel, and then cleaned them up with a quick hand sanding. Remember those grommets from earlier? At this point, I need to open up those holes in the cherry. I start with a series of pilot holes from underneath. Then I use a Forstner bit to remove the bulk of the material. Then I can use the router with a flush trim bit again to clean up the edges. I did one final sanding off camera, and then it's time to apply the finish. For the stain, I'm using a blend with a little red tint to it. At the time, I thought the stain would accentuate the grain, and it did look good on the test piece, but when the whole desk was stained, I think it sort of muted the grain a little. It still looks alright, but if I were to do it again, I probably would not have used any stain. Then for the clear coat, I wanted a thick, hard-wearing, low-maintenance finish that would last for years, so I went with polyurethane. I applied a total of 5 coats. I let each coat cure, and then sanded with 220 in between each coat. Once the final coat had completely cured, I used a car buffer with polishing compound to bring it to a high gloss shine. And of course, I have to add my maker's mark to it. Then it's just a matter of getting everything set up. As I mentioned earlier, the desk is now on a motorized base, and unfortunately I did not get any video of the installation, but here's some video of the desk in action. That about does it for this one. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. And feel free to check out some of my other project videos.